In the rugged heart of the American frontier, where dusty saloons trembled with piano notes and harsh winds rattled battered shutters, three sisters found themselves caught in a desperate fight for freedom. Their father, twisted by greed, had sold them to brutal mining barons who ruled the mountains with iron fists. Few dared to cross these powerful men, but fate can be as wild as the West itself. When two Lakota brothers, guided by honor and fueled by fury, rode in to change the sisters' destiny, a chain of events began that would shake the frontier to its core and forge an unbreakable bond beneath the wide western sky. In the year 1878, White Gulch was little more than a weary stage stop in the Dakota Territory, one with a permanent layer of dust coating every building, wagon, and face that dared linger there. It was a place perpetually suspended between the promise of gold hidden in the hills and the persistent rumor of outlaws waiting around every bend in the trail. The people who drifted through drifters, prospectors, or simply the lost rarely stayed long. But for better or worse, White Gulch was home to the Rosewood family. Ernest Rosewood, a once respected rancher, with eyes the color of tarnished metal, had allowed misfortune and bitterness to eat away at his sense of decency. He'd married young, fathered three daughters, and watched his dreams of prosperity slip away with every failed harvest and every shady deal gone wrong. By the time his wife succumbed to fever one harsh winter, he was so deeply in debt that the pittance he raised from selling off his meager ranch still wasn't enough to settle with the loan sharks and predatory land barons who'd come knocking. Desperation had a way of gnawing at a man's soul, turning him into something unrecognizable. For Ernest, the final thread of his morality snapped one scorching afternoon in August, a day so hot that the dusty ground at White Gulch seemed to shimmer like molten gold. That was the day the unthinkable took shape in his mind. If he couldn't pay back what he owed with land or money, perhaps he could make a deal that might spare him from the wrath of the powerful. The Rosewood sisters, Charlotte, Josephine, and Florence, had never been pampered. They learned to ride horses before they learned their letters, and they spent their early mornings milking the family's scrawny cows, collecting eggs, and chasing goats across the small corral. They were a striking trio, each different in manner and appearance. Charlotte, the eldest at 19, was tall and quiet, a sharp observer of human nature. Josephine, a year younger, was known for her fiery temper and her innate knack for healing animals. Florence, the youngest at 16, was the dreamer, forever clutching a worn-out copy of Wuthering Heights or some other novel that spoke of distant places and grand adventures. They lived in a dilapidated cottage on the far edge of White Gulch, situated near a shallow creek that sometimes swelled with spring runoff. On that sweltering August day, the sisters had gathered along the water's edge, hoping to soak their feet in the cool current. Florence talked about the exotic places she yearned to see one day. Josephine listened with half an ear, while plucking twigs from her hair. Charlotte stood, with arms folded, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. Trouble came in the form of their father. Caked in trail dust reeking of whiskey, and with fury dancing in his eyes, Ernest strode toward them. He wore a threadbare coat that once might have been elegant, but now hung on him like a specter of better times. "You three," he said, voice hoarse, as if he'd spent hours shouting, "Get up to the house." There was no mistaking the anger behind his words. Yet none of them grasped the depth of the betrayal that lurked beneath his callous demeanor. Charlotte asked if there was news from the bank about their mortgage or from the cattle buyer in the next town. Ernest only grunted, spat tobacco into the dust, and twisted the brim of his sweat-stained hat in his hands. Little did they know that not far away, He had just left a meeting with two mining barons' men who'd come from Deadwood after hearing rumors of new veins of gold in the surrounding mountains. Their names were Hawthorne Pike and Leroy Black-Eye Crouch. George Hurst, the real-life mining magnate, had soared to fame prospecting in these parts, but after acquiring enough claims, he and his associates had turned to expanding their empire. Pike and Crouch, though lesser known, were nearly as ruthless. They had a thirst for gold, a disregard for human life, and an appetite for any advantage, however despicable, that might broaden their power. The afternoon sun had been a blazing, merciless witness to the deals struck between Ernest Rosewood and these two men. Pike and Crouch had made it clear they needed leverage in the region, and they were open to any collateral that might serve their ends. Rumor had it they were short on domestics and entertainers for their growing string of establishments near the mines. Ernest, desperate, offered what he had: 3 healthy, able-bodied daughters who could be used in any manner the barons saw fit. In exchange, they'd pay off his debts, and he might even get a chance at a fresh start. The sisters knew nothing of this pact, but they sensed danger as soon as they returned home. Their father locked the front door and told them to pack up a few belongings. "We're traveling." Heading north, he barked. His tone offered no room for questions. Charlotte tried to protest, but Ernest's ragged stare silenced her. She held back tears, summoning the fortitude she'd cultivated over the years. Josephine bristled with rebellious energy, suspecting their father had agreed to something sordid. He stank of guilt. As for Florence, she watched him with wide, frightened eyes, her illusions of a kinder world cracking by the second. Within hours, they were loaded into an old wagon. Hawthorne Pike waited at the reins, his beady eyes and thin-lipped smile sending a shiver through all 3 sisters. Ernest rode alongside, not meeting their gazes. The sisters huddled together, the clatter of the wagon wheels echoing the dread in their hearts. When they passed the sign that read, "Leaving White Gulch," they didn't know if they'd ever return. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the hills. The warm wind carried the scent of an impending downpour. It was as if the skies themselves recognized the dark transaction that had just taken place. And so, on that fateful day, the Rosewood sisters were bound away from the only home they'd ever known, heading straight into the clutches of 2 men whose cruelty knew no limits and whose power in the region was matched only by their greed. The West was vast and untamed, but nowhere near large enough to hide the horrors that were about to unfold, or the improbable alliance that would one day rescue them from it all. The journey north seemed to last an eternity. The wagon jostled over rocky trails and wound through narrow passes, flanked by steep canyon walls. Every lurch or sudden turn threatened to throw one of the sisters out onto the rough ground. If they complained, Hawthorne Pike merely sneered, while Leroy Black-Eye Crouch prodded them with the butt of his rifle. Their father was silent, like a man who'd made a pact with the devil and realized too late the true cost. At dusk, each day, they stopped to rest in shabby makeshift camps. The sisters huddled under coarse blankets, exchanging frightened whispers, while Pike and Crouch drank whiskey by the campfire. The men hardly bothered to hide their sadistic intentions. Their laughter was coarse and cruel as they talked about the sisters as if they were livestock. Even so, Josephine vowed to protect Florence at all costs. Charlotte, the oldest, wrapped her arms around them both, sending a silent prayer into the star-laden sky that some chance of escape would present itself. But how could they escape? They were unarmed, closely guarded, and miles from any settlement. The deepening wilderness seemed to close in around them with each mile. Memories of their childhood at the ranch, their mother's laughter, and the simple joys of daily chores seemed like a lifetime ago. On the evening of the fourth day, they arrived at a valley nestled between jagged hills thick with pine trees. Dim lanterns glowed outside a cluster of weather-beaten shacks, marking the outskirts of a mining settlement. Wooden signs, hammered haphazardly into the ground, read Red Hawk Spur, a name that was as ominous as the stories told about it. This was where Pike and Crouch oversaw operations for one of the region's largest gold extraction sites. As they passed rows of tents and shackled workers, the sisters realized this place was a prison under the open sky. Ragged miners, some hired many, forced labored from dawn until well after dusk, clawing at the mountains in search of gold. Some wore broken shackles, half in illusions that they were free to leave, but trapped by the lack of any real options. Others were men from distant lands, their eyes hollow from exhaustion and despair. Pike halted the wagon near a sagging bunkhouse. The sisters were yanked out and corralled like cattle. "Welcome to Red Hawk Spur," he announced with a sneer. "You'll find the accommodations adequate." Crouch chuckled, his single good eye glinting with malevolence. Ernest dismounted his horse, face pale in the lantern light. So you'll see to my debts, right?" That was the deal. His voice was taut, like a man trying to reassure himself he wasn't the worst wretch in creation. Pike patted him on the shoulder. "Settle down, Rosewood. You'll get what's coming to you, and we'll be sure to take good care of your daughters." The mocking tone dripped with cruel insinuations. That night, they locked the sisters in a small room attached to the bunkhouse with battered furniture and a single cot. Outside, they posted 2 armed guards. Even the sound of the night wind scraping against the wooden walls seemed threatening. Curled up on the cold floor, the sisters braced themselves for what might come next. Charlotte held Josephine and Florence, tightly determined not to show fear even as her heart pounded with terror. She whispered a promise, "I swear I'll find a way to get us out." When morning light crept through the cracks in the wall, it revealed the harsh daily life at Red Hawk Spur. The sisters were forced to cook clean and serve the men who ran the operation. Florence, her hands trembling, scrubbed floors under the watchful eye of the guards. Josephine was ordered to haul water from the creek, her muscles aching by midday. Charlotte was tasked with mending clothes and reading out letters to the illiterate workers, some of whom looked at her with pity, others with lust. The days blended into one monotonous nightmare, each hour filled with the knowledge that far darker possibilities might still await them. Ernest, meanwhile, roamed the camp, alternating between pride at having solved his financial woes and disgust at having sacrificed his own children. Once or twice he tried to approach them, muttering about how this was all a means to an end, how he'd find a way to bring them back when his finances were stable. But each time, Josephine's fiery stare stopped him cold. Her glare spoke of betrayal so deep it could never be forgiven. Within a few days, rumors began circulating among the miners about new expansions further into Lakota territory. Some whispered that the Lakota people, led by men who refused to be displaced any longer, had started taking matters into their own hands. Horses gone missing, encampments torched under the cover of night. But to Pike, Crouch and their associates, such talk was merely background noise. They believed themselves invincible, guided by greed, and protected by a corrupt web of officials on their payroll. Yet trouble was brewing, fueled by more than gold dust and stolen land. Somewhere in the hills, unknown to the sisters, 2 Lakota brothers were scouting the region, gathering information about the exploitation of their people's sacred ground. Word of the Rosewood sisters would soon reach them, though how, when, or in what manner remained uncertain. For now, the sisters endured their spirits, wearing down day by day, but still clinging to hope. In hushed voices at night, they made plans to escape. Could they steal horses? Could they bribe a guard? Charlotte tried to coax information from the literate miners whose letters she read. Josephine, ever the hothead, sharpened a stolen kitchen knife in secret. Florence wept into her pillow, then chastised herself for her tears, determined not to be the weak link. They had only each other and the faint prayer that fate might soon give them a fighting chance. The ridges around Red Hawk Spur were part of a landscape that had been sacred to the Lakota for generations. Thick pine forests stretched across rolling hills. Narrow streams glinted under bright sun. Wildlife roamed the meadows. This land, so brutally transformed by mining, had once provided for entire tribes. The relentless incursion of miners and fortune-seekers had disrupted the Lakota's way of life. Among those who refused to let this injustice go unchallenged were two brothers, Chaska and Ahanu. They belonged to a band of Lakota that had migrated through these hills for centuries, following the seasons and the herds. In their youth, they'd listened to elders tell tales of how the land was to be respected, how every living thing was part of a great spirit. Now they watched in anger and sorrow as the hills were blasted apart for gold that would line the pockets of unscrupulous men. Chaska was the elder brother, tall and lean, with intense dark eyes that reflected his inner resolve. He spoke softly, preferring silence to reckless confrontation. Ahanu, younger by 2 years, was quick-tempered and bold traits that served him well in battle, but sometimes led him into trouble. Together, they moved through the forests like shadows, scouting the camps and outposts erected by the mining barons. They had heard the name George Hurst whispered by many, but it was Hawthorne Pike and Leroy Crouch who most recently attracted their ire. Red Hawk Spur sat on land that the brothers considered sacred ground, a place once used for ceremonial gatherings. Now, it was a site of exploitation and cruelty. One early morning, they crouched behind a thicket overlooking the settlement. The first rays of sunlight illuminated columns of smoke rising from the ore-processing fires. Chaska's keen eyes spotted something new, 3 young women carrying buckets of water toward a row of tents. Not typical workers, Ahanu noted. Even from this distance, he could see these women were not hardened miners or weary men. They moved hesitantly, as though under threat. A guard trailed them, rifle resting on his shoulder. "We need to know who they are," Chaska said, eyes narrowing. This place was bad enough before they started bringing. His words faltered, but the anger in them was clear. He knew all too well how women were sometimes used in these camps. "We'll move closer tonight." Come nightfall, the brothers slipped through a gap in the wooden fence on the outskirts of the camp. Dressed in buckskin and with their hair tied back in braids, they blended effortlessly with the shadows. They'd made contact with a handful of sympathetic workers before men forced into near-slavery men who understood that the Lakota were not the true enemy. A quick conversation with one such worker revealed that the 3 women were the property of Hawthorne Pike, recently acquired under suspicious circumstances. "Sold by their own father, they say," whispered the worker, a middle-aged man with haunted eyes. "They're locked up in the bunkhouse by night. Keep your voices low, or the guards will have both our hides." For Chaska and Ahanu, this discovery was a bitter confirmation of everything they despised about the white man's intrusion greed, so relentless It drove a father to sell his daughters. Protecting the land was one thing. Protecting innocent lives was another. And the moral imperative to intervene became clearer than ever. Before dawn broke, they slipped back into the woods, their path lit by the faint glow of the waning moon. Under a gnarled oak, they conferred about their next move. "She's just a girl," Ahanu murmured, recalling the youngest of the sisters who'd stumbled under the weight of her bucket. "You can see the fear in her eyes. They can't stay there." Chaska nodded gravely. "It's not just about them. If we can help them, maybe we can disrupt Pike's operation. Force him to leave these lands or bring more attention to his crimes." But how to free 3 guarded sisters from one of the most notorious mining outposts in the territory? With limited manpower, direct confrontation would be suicide. The Lakota band was not large enough to wage open war against the well-armed camp. They had to be stealthy, strategic. It was decided they would watch, learn the guards' routines, and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. As days stretched into weeks, a fragile routine formed around the Rosewood sisters. They rose before dawn to start their chores, labored under the watchful gaze of Pike's henchmen, and collapsed into fitful sleep by night. Charlotte's eyes grew hollow as she mended endless piles of clothes for the miners and read out official letters to a few men who needed to keep in touch with families far away. Josephine's hands became rough and calloused from lugging heavy sacks of grain and water. Florence's once hopeful spirit frayed at the edges, manifesting in a nervous habit of biting her nails until they bled, though physically grueling their chores were far from their worst fear. Every time Pike or Crouch leered at them, the sisters felt a cold dread in their stomachs. Occasionally, drunken men would saunter too close at night, rapping on the walls of the bunkhouse and making vulgar remarks. Thankfully, the presence of armed guards, though not exactly benevolent, prevented complete anarchy. But Charlotte knew the arrangement was temporary. The tension in the air thickened with each passing day, fueling the sisters' dread that soon Pike's patience would run out, and he might force them into more intimate servitude. One morning, Josephine was tasked with delivering a letter from the camp's quartermaster to a small trading post 2 miles away. It was the first time any of them had left the mining camp since their arrival. She sensed an opportunity. If only she could slip away, find a horse, or hide in the forest, she might come back at night to rescue her sisters. The notion was daring, but Josephine's fiery determination had grown in direct proportion to her hatred of Pike. She never got the chance. A single guard named Amos hovered at her side, pressing his rifle muzzle lightly against her back whenever she lagged. Amos was a wiry man with a pockmarked face and a thin mustache that he stroked whenever she looked at him wrong. "Don't get any ideas," he muttered more than once. "I ain't paid to chase after runaways." Still, Josephine gleaned bits of the outside world during this short journey. She overheard one store clerk telling another about Lakota sightings near the next ridge over. Then she spotted footprints around a creek tracks that might not have belonged to any miners. The swirl of rumors and signs of clandestine visitors gave her a small spark of hope. Perhaps someone out there was ready to challenge the tyranny of men like Pike and Crouch. Back at Red Hawk Spur, Ernest Rosewood skulked around trying to avoid the gaze of his daughters. Regret had taken root, but he was too cowardly to rectify his betrayal. Occasionally, he'd approach Charlotte, offering hollow reassurances. I'm working on it. I'll get you all out of here. Just be patient." She never believed him, and he never believed himself. Time blurred. The sisters felt their energies sapped by forced labor and oppressive dread. Then, late one evening, when the lamps had been extinguished in most of the settlement, they heard a faint tapping at the bunkhouse window. Charlotte roused from a shallow slumber. Josephine crept to the window, pressing her ear against the glass. They could see no one outside, but the tapping repeated a careful, intentional code. Josephine glanced at Charlotte. Could it be an ally? Or was it a trap summoning courage? Charlotte lifted the flimsy window latch. A small folded paper slid through the crack and dropped onto the windowsill. By the time she peered out, the figure, if indeed there was one, had melted into the darkness. They gathered around the flickering light of a single candle, hearts pounding, as Charlotte carefully opened the note. In shaky English, it read, "We know you are held against your will. We will try to help. Wait for night of next full moon. Watch for our signal, a cry like a nighthawk. Stay strong." It was unsigned, no name or mark, but the mere existence of it was like a lightning bolt of hope. Florence's eyes welled with tears. Josephine's fists clenched with determined excitement. Charlotte exhaled, feeling for the first time that they were no longer alone in their suffering. Chaska and Ahanu had taken great risk delivering that note. They studied a few phrases of English but weren't fluent, so they enlisted the help of a sympathetic trapper they had befriended. Together, they crafted the short, urgent message. It had taken days of quiet observation to find the right time to place it at the bunkhouse window, undetected. From their hidden vantage points in the woods, the Lakota brothers continued to watch. Red Hawk Spur was busy day and night, but security slackened in the hour before dawn, when the guards were most fatigued. That was the window for any real attempt at rescue. They decided the night of the next full moon was their best chance. The brighter night sky might reduce the advantage of darkness, but it also meant easier visibility if gunfire erupted. They had no illusions about the risk. Breaking 3 captives out from a heavily armed mining camp was more akin to a military operation than a simple infiltration. In the days leading up to the full moon, they laid detailed plans. They charted guard patrols, they identified potential escape routes, a narrow gorge to the west, a hidden creek path behind the ore mills. They also recruited a handful of men who harbored grudges against Pike and Crouch miners who'd lost friends to accidents in the tunnels, or had their wages stolen through rigged gambling. These men would discreetly create distractions when the time came. Despite the complexities, the moral necessity was clear. Chaska and Ahanu knew that if they waited too long, the sisters might be sent away or become victims of Pike's vile appetites. Every hour was precious. 2 nights before the planned rescue, the tension in camp reached a boiling point. Leroy Black-Eye Crouch returned from an inspection of the upper shaft in a foul mood. Production had slowed, and he blamed it on slackers who needed to be reminded of their place. He stormed into the bunkhouse, brandishing a whip, looking for someone to punish. Sadly, his rage fixed upon the Rosewood sisters, who were in the common area polishing utensils. He roared at Charlotte, pointing the whip's handle in her face. "Think you're special? 'Cause you can read and write? The men are complaining they can't get no rest with the 3 of you sniveling around. You're worthless." Charlotte tried to remain composed, but fear constricted her throat. Josephine stepped forward, eyes flashing. "Leave her alone," she hissed. Crouch's single good eye twisted with sadistic glee. "A feisty one, eh?" He raised the whip, bringing it down hard. Josephine managed to dodge the brunt of the blow, but the tip still lashed across her forearm. She winced in pain, glaring defiantly. In that moment, Florence sprang up from behind with a pot intending to smash it over Crouch's head, but a guard intervened, grappling her and forcing her to drop the makeshift weapon. Crouch's lips curled into a grin that was half amusement, half fury. Before he could strike again, Ernest Rosewood, drawn by the commotion, burst into the room. For once, paternal instinct or guilt overpowered his cowardice. "Stop it," he yelled, placing himself between Crouch and the sisters. "I won't let you." Crouch sneered. "Oh, now you're playing father? Where was that fatherly devotion when you sold them to us? You sold them cheap too." The words sliced through the bunkhouse with the finality of a death knell. Josephine's expression darkened at this public confirmation of her father's treachery. Charlotte trembled, remembering every worthless excuse he'd made. Florence buried her face in her hands, tears streaming. The other miners in the bunkhouse shuffled uneasily, none daring to openly intervene, but some wore expressions that betrayed empathy. Ernest's face flushed with shame. "I didn't have a choice," he stammered, voice choking. "But that doesn't mean you can—" Crouch slammed the butt of his whip handle into Ernest's gut, doubling him over. "You ain't got no say in how we discipline our property. Next time, keep your sniveling opinions to yourself." With that, he gestured for the guards to disperse, and they followed him out, leaving the sisters to stare in stunned silence at their father, who lay gasping for breath on the floor. Not a word was spoken until Ernest managed to get back on his feet, leaning against a broken chair for support. His daughters stood in a tense half-circle. Josephine's arm throbbed from the whip's cut. Florence's cheeks glistened with tears, while Charlotte's eyes shone with cold anger. Ernest opened his mouth to speak, but Charlotte cut him off. "You sold us," she said, her voice thick with betrayal. "You sold us like cattle to these monsters. Don't you dare pretend you have any right to protect us now." He tried to respond, sputtering, "I'm sorry, I had no way out," but Josephine turned her back, and Florence refused to meet his gaze. In that moment, it seemed the last threads of any familial bond disintegrated. Ernest slunk away, a broken shell of a man. Perhaps he truly intended to make amends one day, but as Charlotte had said, he no longer had the right to call himself their father. At last, the night of the full moon arrived. The pale glow bathed Red Hawk Spur in an otherworldly silver sheen. A hush fell over the camp as many of the miners turned in early, hoping to escape the chill that swept down from the hills. Inside the cramped bunkhouse room, Charlotte, Josephine, and Florence sat together, fully clothed hearts pounding with anticipation. They had chosen not to undress for bed, suspecting something might happen. Their eyes darted to the window each time the wind rustled the shutters. Just past midnight, a distant cry echoed through the valley, the sound of a night hawk or a faithful imitation. The sisters' hearts leaped in unison. Josephine nudged Charlotte. "That's the signal." Charlotte nodded, biting her lip. She peered outside, scanning for movement. After a minute, she saw a flash of light. A lantern flicked on and off in the woods. Summoning their courage, they quietly opened the door a crack. The corridor was dark, the only illumination coming from a lantern left on a hook near the front entrance. Through the front window, they could see a guard stationed outside, leaning against a post. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, his head drooping in drowsiness. Another guard circled around the perimeter, disappearing behind the bunkhouse every few minutes. Josephine, brandishing her small kitchen knife, motioned for Florence to stay close. Charlotte took the lead, tiptoeing across the floorboards. Before they could slip outside, a heavy footstep in the corridor made them freeze. It was Amos the guard who had escorted Josephine to the trading post. He paused near the bunkhouse entrance, rummaging in his pockets for matches to light a cigar. Breathless seconds passed. The sisters crouched behind, the corner hearts racing. If they couldn't get past Amos, the entire plan would be ruined. Just then, somewhere beyond the bunkhouse, a loud crash erupted, followed by raised voices and a muffled shout. One of the conspirators among the miners had toppled a stack of wooden crates near the ore mill, creating the perfect distraction. Amos muttered a curse and dashed toward the noise, leaving the entrance unguarded. The sisters seized their moment, slipping outside into the cool night air. The moon illuminated the yard, revealing the guard by the post had left his station to investigate the commotion. Several men shouted in confusion, torn between responding to the mysterious crash or standing guard. Sticking to the shadows, the sisters darted behind a row of barrels. They could see the faint glow of a lantern deeper in the woods, blinking 3 times in succession, the sign that their allies were waiting. A few more steps, and they'd be free of the camp's inner perimeter. That was when a voice barked out. Halt! A guard, returning from his patrol, spotted them. "Stop, or I'll shoot!" Josephine reacted first, flinging her knife. The blade glanced off the guard's forearm. Not a fatal blow, but enough to make him yelp in pain. He fumbled for his rifle. Charlotte and Florence sprinted while Josephine followed, trying to stay ahead of the guard's line of sight. They zigzagged between tents, ignoring the startled curses of half-awake miners. Before the guard could raise his rifle to fire, a shadow swept behind him. A moment later, he dropped to the ground, stunned. Chaska, his tomahawk raised, stepped into the moonlight. Ahanu appeared next, gesturing frantically to the sisters. This way, the sisters, breathless and shaking, recognized them as the Lakota men who had left the note. Josephine's chest heaved. Charlotte clutched Florence's hand. Though they were terrified, these strangers were their only hope. Gunshots rang out from the other side of the camp. More guards had discovered the ruse. Chaska and Ahanu led the sisters through a gap in the fence, the miners they'd bribed creating chaos behind them. Flames licked the edges of a makeshift shed where mining tools were stored, adding to the confusion. A bullet whizzed past their heads, embedding itself in a tree trunk. The sisters scrambled down a narrow ravine, guided by the Lakota brothers' sure-footedness. Adrenaline fueled their flight until they reached a boulder-strewn creek. There, a pair of horses waited along with 3 men from the Lakota band. The sisters climbed into the saddle with Chaska and Ahanu's help. Urgency hummed in the air like a living thing. Behind them, the camp was in an uproar. Fires, gunshots, shouting. But they couldn't linger. Galloping hoofbeats echoed against the rocks as the group rode into the forest, each jolt reminding the sisters how close they were to death or freedom. Dawn found them high in the pine-covered ridges at a makeshift Lakota encampment nestled near a crystal-clear lake. The sisters, disoriented and exhausted, dismounted with wobbly legs. Lakota women emerged from the teepees, offering blankets and hot tea brewed from local herbs. Despite the language barriers, kindness and empathy were evident in every gesture. Chaska led them to a small fire pit. "Safe here," he said in halting English. "We ride further soon." Ahanu crouched beside Josephine, offering water for her wounded arm. He carefully washed the crusted blood, then applied a poultice of crushed herbs to soothe the swelling. Josephine winced, but managed a grateful smile, albeit still cautious. Charlotte cradled Florence, who trembled from both cold and shock. Through gestures and broken English, Chaska and Ahanu explained that they couldn't remain in one place too long, as Pike's men might organize a pursuit. They intended to take the sisters deeper into the mountains beyond the usual patrol routes. From there, they would figure out the next steps, possibly to contact sympathetic settlers or even arrange safe passage to a larger town like Deadwood, ironically, the same area from which Pike and Crouch had come. Over the next few days, the sisters recovered among the Lakota. Though the situation was far from ideal, they felt more humane treatment here than they ever had at Red Hawk Spur. Florence, eyes brimming with amazement, found comfort in the gentle lullabies sung by the Lakota women. Josephine, who'd always had a knack for tending animals, befriended a young horse that grazed near camp. Charlotte spent her time talking with Chaska, gleaning bits of information about the territory, how the Lakota had been displaced, and the brothers' vow to defend their homeland. In turn, the sisters told their story, how their father had sold them, how they'd endured daily humiliation, and how Crouch's brutality had finally reached its boiling point. Though the Lakota didn't fully grasp all the nuances of white society, they understood injustice and betrayal all too well. A quiet bond formed between these two small groups, forged by shared pain and a desire for justice. High above the summer skies began to shift thick clouds rolling in from the west. It was as if nature itself sensed the coming confrontation. Word traveled fast in the rugged frontier. Hawthorne Pike and Leroy Crouch had put a bounty on the sisters' heads, and especially on the savages who stole them away. One afternoon, as Charlotte helped grind corn beside an older Lakota woman named Winyan, she overheard raised voices near the edge of camp. She peeked outside and saw a Hanu arguing with a younger Lakota scout. The scout's face was etched with concern, pointing toward the valley. Chaska joined them, arms folded, listening intently. When they broke up their discussion, Charlotte mustered her courage to approach. "What happened?" she asked Chaska in English, hoping he'd understand. He furrowed his brow, searching for the right words. "Men on horses, 8 or 10. Guns. We see them in valley searching. Sentries say they near the pass." He paused. "We must go soon." Indeed, staying put was no longer feasible. If they were caught, the sisters' fate would be worse than before, and the Lakota, already vulnerable, would be punished severely. Chaska proposed a plan. They'd break camp the next morning, moving at first light. The route led across a steep pass that only the Lakota knew well. After a day's ride, they'd arrive at a settlement that was rumored to be more tolerant of their presence and far enough from Pike and Crouch's immediate grasp. Despite the wise plan, fate rarely bows to convenience. That very night, with rain beginning to patter on the teepees, a cry went up from the camp's perimeter. Figures on horseback emerged through the pines, lanterns and rifles cutting eerie silhouettes. The sisters grabbed what few belongings they had, huddling in the center of camp with the Lakota as thunder rumbled across the sky. In a swirl of confusion, the Lakota warriors attempted to guide the sisters away from danger. But Amos the guard from Red Hawk Spur was among the armed riders. He spotted the sisters, his eyes burning with triumph. "There they are, over there." The muzzle of his rifle flashed a bullet, slicing the night air. Chaska tackled Florence, rolling her out of the bullet's path. Josephine ducked behind a tree, heart hammering. Charlotte scanned the chaos for an opening, then saw a figure that made her blood run cold. Leroy Crouch, himself face twisted with hatred, scanning for them. A Hanu flung a spear that grazed a rider, unseating him. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the frantic scene of Lakota men on foot, a few on horseback, trying to repel the invaders. Shots rang out from both sides, muzzle flashes momentarily revealing the fear and determination etched on every face. Josephine found herself cornered by Amos near a fallen log. He raised his rifle, but before he could pull the trigger, she lunged forward with a dagger Chaska had gifted her, a short, ornately decorated blade. The weapon cut across Amos's forearm, causing him to yelp in pain. She kicked at his knee, forcing him to the ground. For a moment, her rage tempted her to finish him off. But something in her froze. She realized she could not kill in cold blood. Instead, she sprinted away, tears mingling with the rain, leaving Amos writhing on the ground. At the center of camp, Crouch had dismounted, brandishing a pistol. He aimed it wildly, searching for the sisters. A Lakota warrior charged him with a tomahawk, but Crouch fired point blank, the warrior collapsing in a lifeless heap. Charlotte, witnessing this horror, could scarcely breathe. She tugged at Florence's hand, trying to lead her away. But Crouch spotted them, his wicked grin returning. "Thought you could run from me, girls? Your father's worthless hide isn't here to save you now." Lightning flashed, revealing the glint in his single good eye. He leveled the pistol at Florence. Time seemed to slow. Chaska roared from behind, swinging his tomahawk at Crouch's arm. The blow landed, forcing Crouch to drop the pistol, which fired harmlessly into the dirt. They grappled, each man straining for control. Crouch's strength was fueled by raw hatred, while Chaska fought with the fury of a defender, protecting his homeland and the innocent. Josephine, rejoining her sisters, watched as the two men writhed in the mud. Ultimately, Chaska landed a decisive blow to Crouch's head, knocking him senseless. "Go run," he gasped at them. Into the woods, Ahanu joined them, leading the sisters away from the camp. The rain soaked them to the bone. Behind them, a cacophony of gunfire and shouts resonated through the night. Torches had ignited some teepees, casting flickering orange light on the chaos. The group pushed deeper into the forest, hearts heavy. They did not know how many Lakota had fallen or if they could ever return to that place. By dawn, they were far from the destroyed camp, trudging through soggy undergrowth. Exhaustion waited every step. They stopped near a rocky outcrop to regroup. Chaska had a bleeding wound on his left shoulder. Florence's eyes were wide and hollow with shock. Josephine gently tended to Chaska's wound, grateful for the little knowledge of herb lore she'd picked up. Charlotte approached Ahanu, her voice quiet. "What do we do now?" "Find safer ground," he replied, a noticeable strain in his tone. "If we stay, they will come again." It weighed heavily on them that by rescuing the sisters, the Lakota had drawn violence upon their people. Yet running back to Red Hawk Spur or White Gulch was unthinkable. Their best hope lay in continuing onward until they reached a settlement beyond Pike and Crouch's immediate influence. From the vantage point on the rocky outcrop, they surveyed a valley below, dotted with pine and birch trees. A winding river cut through the landscape. Somewhere along that river, the brothers hoped to find a safe haven. The sisters had no choice but to trust them. In the following days, they traveled by stealth, avoiding main roads. Once they glimpsed a posse of armed men crossing the river, presumably searching for them. The memory of that raid on the Lakota camp, the flames dancing among the teepees, haunted them. Josephine felt a constant pang of guilt. "They attacked because of us," she told Charlotte one night. Charlotte's response was gentle but firm. "They attacked because Pike and Crouch wanted to profit from cruelty. We didn't ask for any of this." It was a hollow reassurance, but the only one they had. Gradually, their small group found a reluctant rhythm. Chaska's wound improved under Josephine's diligent care. Ahanu proved adept at hunting. He'd often return with rabbit or fish, and Florence would help prepare it. Charlotte took charge of rationing their supplies, which were meager but sufficient for now. Along the way, they encountered other refugees, a family of settlers from Ohio who had lost everything to a con artist, a lone preacher, heading to a distant mission, and once, quite unexpectedly, Ernest Rosewood himself. The sisters spotted him from a distance, near a muddy wagon trail. He was alone, unarmed, looking half-crazed with worry. They ducked out of sight, not ready for any confrontation. Josephine seethed with anger, but Charlotte pointed out that he looked broken and desperate. "He may regret what he did," she whispered, "but that doesn't mean we owe him anything." Eventually, they drew near to the small frontier town of Elder Creek, perched beside the wide, swirling waters of the Missouri River. Word on the trails was that Elder Creek had a new sheriff, a grizzled Civil War veteran named Franklin Boyd, rumored to run a tight ship. With any luck, the law here might be less corrupt than in White Gulch or Red Hawk Spur. Before entering the settlement, Chaska and Ahanu conferred with the sisters. They knew that native peoples were often turned away, or worse. "This place might not welcome us," Ahanu said plainly. Charlotte insisted. "You saved our lives. We're not going in there without you." Josephine and Florence nodded in agreement. They approached Elder Creek at twilight. The main street was lined with weathered storefronts, a general store, a blacksmith, a modest bank. A single saloon, named the River's Bounty, glowed with amber lamplight. The clop of horses' hooves echoed as they entered. Townspeople paused to stare. A handful retreated indoors. Suspicion was palpable. A deputy emerged from the sheriff's office, rifle in hand. "Hold it right there," he called. The group complied, hands, visible hearts pounding. "What's your business in Elder Creek?" Charlotte stepped forward. We're seeking refuge. We were held against our will by criminals. These men," she gestured to Chaska and Ahanu, "saved us. We don't want any trouble." The deputy's gaze flickered between them, particularly the Lakota brothers, who stood stoically. After a tense pause, he motioned them to wait and ducked into the sheriff's office. Moments later, the lawman himself emerged, Sheriff Franklin Boyd, tall, with a deeply lined face and a star pinned to his vest. Boyd assessed the scene with narrowed eyes. "You say you were rescued by these fellas, and that criminals are after you?" His voice carried the authority of a man who'd seen too many tragedies in this land. Charlotte explained their ordeal in halting detail, aware that revealing they were sold might shock the locals. She omitted some specifics, focusing on the threat posed by Pike and Crouch. "We need a place to stay, at least until we figure out our next steps," she concluded. Boyd listened quietly, occasionally glancing at Chaska and Ahanu. In the end, he sighed. "Elder Creek is a peaceful place. We don't turn away folks who've done no harm. You can stay, but if trouble follows you here, I expect you to cooperate. Understand?" They agreed. Though not effusive, Boyd's acceptance was a lifeline. As the sun set, the sisters and their Lakota protectors found themselves in a modest boarding house run by a widow named Clara Mulligan. She eyed the group warily at first, but softened when she saw the sisters' tired faces. For a week or so, the group settled into a semblance of routine. Chaska and Ahanu camped just outside town by the river's edge, occasionally venturing in to visit the sisters at the boarding house. Josephine volunteered her help at the local stable, proving her skill with horses. Florence assisted Clara with chores, showing a gentleness that earned the widow's grudging respect. Charlotte spent time at the modest library in the town hall, reading up on laws and mining regulations, seeking any legal recourse to hold Pike and Crouch accountable. Yet none of them believed this respite would last forever. Pike, Crouch, or their hired guns could arrive at any moment. Each day, they cast anxious glances down the dusty road leading into Elder Creek. Late one afternoon, as the air chilled with the onset of autumn, a frantic rider galloped into town. He halted before the sheriff's office, shouting for help. Sheriff Boyd and the deputy hurried out. The sisters, who happened to be nearby, fetching supplies, froze as they recognized the rider Ernest Rosewood, battered and bleeding, eyes wild with terror. He nearly toppled off his horse, gasping, "They're coming!" Pike and Crouch, men with guns, burned down a farm. His words tumbled in disjointed panic. Just a few miles behind, heading here. They know the girls are here. A hush descended on Main Street. Townspeople emerged from shops, fear etched on their faces. An attack on Elder Creek threatened all of them, not just the Rosewood sisters. Boyd turned to the crowd. "Arm yourselves, folks. Looks like we're in for trouble." Josephine watched her father slump against his horse, tears streaming down his face. Part of her wanted to leave him there, but Charlotte, though she despised what he'd done, stepped forward to help him dismount. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he mumbled, unable to meet their eyes. Minutes later, the bell atop the small church rang out, summoning any able-bodied person to defend the town. Within the hour, a makeshift militia had formed, farmers with shotguns, an ex-soldier or two with old rifles, and a few rowdy youths eager for a fight. Chaska and Ahanu prepared quietly, checking their bows knives and the single rifle they'd bartered for along the journey. Dusk settled over Elder Creek, casting the town in violet shadows. Sheriff Boyd had men positioned behind barrels and wagons. The townsfolk held rifles and pitchforks, their faces tight with fear. The sisters were told to stay in the cellar of the boarding house, but Charlotte and Josephine refused to hide. Only Florence remained behind, ready to tend to the wounded. Torchlight flickered beyond the ridge. Hawthorne Pike and Leroy Crouch had arrived with a dozen armed riders. Sheriff Boyd stepped into the street. "State your business," he called out. Pike rode forward, his expression cold. "We want the Rosewood sisters. Give them up, and no one gets hurt." Charlotte stepped into view. "We don't belong to you, and this town won't let you take us," Crouch snarled. "Then we burn it down." A single gunshot cracked the night, and chaos erupted. Riders surged forward. Townsfolk returned fire from behind crates and saloon windows. Arrows flew from the shadows as Chaska and Ahanu struck from the flanks. Josephine crouched beside Charlotte, exchanging fire with a revolver she'd been given. Ernest Rosewood, shotgun in hand, took cover near the church, perhaps trying to make amends at last. Bullets ripped through the street, kicking up dust and splinters. Pike was unhorsed by a lucky shot. He staggered upright and took aim at Charlotte, who was mid-reload and vulnerable. Josephine screamed, but before Pike could pull the trigger, a second shot rang out. He collapsed, a bloody hole in his chest. Ernest stood behind him, rifle smoking his face, pale with shock. Crouch, watching Pike fall, howled in rage. He aimed at Ernest and fired. Ernest stumbled, blood darkening his shirt. Josephine retaliated, shooting Crouch in the shoulder. An arrow from Ahanu followed, striking true. Crouch dropped to the ground with a gasp and didn't rise again. With both leaders down, Pike's men faltered. Some fled. Others surrendered. The townspeople surged from their hiding spots to tend the wounded. Florence ran from the cellar, finding her sisters kneeling over their father. Ernest, bloodied and broken, grasped Charlotte's hand. "I'm sorry for everything," he whispered. "You're free now." His chest rose once more, then stilled. He died with tears in his daughter's eyes, neither fully redeemed nor entirely condemned. Chaska and Ahanu stood nearby in silent respect. The town had survived, but nothing would ever be the same. Amid the smoking ruins and soft cries of the injured, a new bond had been forged, not just among sisters, but between two worlds that had once stood apart. 3 days after the battle, Elder Creek held a quiet funeral behind the church. Among the pine boxes lay Ernest Rosewood. His daughters stood by in silence, grieving not just his death, but the pain and betrayal he had caused. In the end, he had saved Charlotte, a final act that, though not enough to erase his sins, left its mark. With Pike and Crouch gone, Red Hawk Spur collapsed, and White Gulch held only bad memories. The sisters faced a new future, unclaimed, uncertain, but finally theirs. Sheriff Boyd offered them a place in Elder Creek. "You've earned it," he said. Josephine began working with the town's horses, dreaming of her own stable. Florence helped Clara at the boarding house, drawn to the idea of one day starting a school. Charlotte, fluent and thoughtful, was asked to assist the town clerk. Chaska and Ahanu prepared to return to their people. Parting was bittersweet. On the morning of their farewell, Josephine gave Ahanu a carved token, a horse's head, symbolizing gratitude. The sisters embraced the brothers, their bond deep, despite few shared words. "You are safe now," Chaska said, before riding into the rising sun. As their figures disappeared over the ridge, Charlotte, Josephine, and Florence stood hand in hand. They had lost a home, a father, and a childhood, but gained strength, purpose, and a new beginning. The past would always linger, but under the clear skies of Elder Creek, the sisters began to heal. Thank you for sharing in the Rosewood sisters' harrowing tale, a testament to the human will to survive, love, and fight for justice, even in the untamed expanses of the American frontier. Their odyssey reminds us that family can wound, and heal betrayal can be followed by redemption, and hope often emerges from the darkest trials. Through the courage of Lakota brothers who risked everything to save them, Charlotte, Josephine, and Florence found not only their freedom, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Now, settled in the peaceful town of Elder Creek, their story continues to inspire. If you found yourself moved by their story of struggle and triumph, help keep their legacy alive. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support ensures more incredible stories are told, stories where resilience conquers fear and hope shines in the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next adventure.